The 10th house is the place of the culmination of purpose. In exoteric astrology, it is typically associated with career, vocation. It is our public self, that which we externalize ourselves as, hence vocation or career. How we present to the world, a little bit different to the first angular house, the first house, where it is the immediate impression of the personality itself and in its most raw expression in essence. Whereas the 10th house, it is more of this collective space. It is that ultimate persona that we emerge out as. It is the opposite to the 4th house, where we talked about roots and ancestry, the mother principle in terms of the forms from which we come. In the opposition here, we do see the importance of, or the inherent relationship between our roots and our foundations, and that which is most core to us as being, let's say, symbolically representative of the roots on the tree, where the deeper the roots go, the more we can emerge up and out as the tree, which is often in psychology and depth psychology an image of the self, roots going deep down to hell and being able to grow up and out and then bestow our fruits upon the world, so to speak, which would lead into the 11th house, the Aquarian house, where we've got the world service or the groups which we serve and are a part of in that sense. So the 10th house is really this place of purpose. In Western astrology, it is typically associated with authority figures and the father as well. Although I should mention that in Vedic astrology, the father is most typically associated with the 9th house. Now you can see both here depending on the individual chart in question. The 9th house, as we previously discussed, is one of meaning and of principle and of the logos, hence why the sun is considered to have its joy there, at least in the Hellenistic tradition. But in either case, with the 9th house, we've got the principle of meaning, which is what the father archetype does, dogma, understanding of the world, and the educational component. So the Vedic astrologers would say that the father gives advice and gives instruction that helps one understand the world, and that is the teaching and educating role of the principle of consciousness. However, in the 10th house, it still works as a father principle because we're talking about that of purpose and the culmination of our known will. And in that way, it is masculine in essence. So we can see depictions of the father sometimes in the 10th house as well. That would also correspond to the father archetype, psychologically speaking, particularly in the case of an instance where we might have a negative father complex in an individual, where this is really associated with an inability to execute or take one's position in the world. 10th house, reaching out, grasping, purpose, here I am, this is what I'm here to do, this is the height of achievement. So when there's a negative father complex, there's a difficulty reaching out and grasping that purpose. Someone may be perfectly competent, gifted, talented in their particular vocational area. And if they have a negative father complex, there's always something that seems to just get in the way of them being able to reach out and grab that purpose. And in various myths and fairy tales, the negative father complex is often depicted with our hero or heroine actually having the hands cut off. So this interesting symbol here of the grasping of life. And of course, the hand is the extremity with which we can reach out and not just grasp, but also express. So this, coming back to this height thing, of course, the 10th house corresponds to Capricorn, the mountain peak. And the 10th house is also at the top of the chart, the most elevated space. So it is that which we build up towards if the bottom half of the chart, as we've been exploring, is more of these personal procedures, more of the individualized level of skill building and working out one's own unique intelligence. And then as we go into the 7th house and heading up into that top sphere, it's now how we bring that out into the world and complete the picture in that sense. So esoterically considered, it's all these same themes. However, we're focusing on the actualization of the soul's purpose as opposed to the ambitions of the personality. So on the one hand, the exoteric 10th house can depict career and vocation. That would be the same esoterically. However, the 10th house, planets in there, the sign cusping the 10th house, and transits to the 10th house will indicate, when the chart is responding esoterically, certain expansions of consciousness, recognition of spiritual purpose, and of course also the actualization of spiritual purpose as well. But that might be a bit further down the track. A really significant transit to the 10th house in an esoterically expressing chart might not demonstrate as a change in career or being recognized in one's vocational space, but it may quite literally be a revelation of the purpose, a seeing of the mountaintop, or receiving that divine guidance from the Father principle. So it is speaking to the spiritualized aspect of Capricorn, and we have that really strong dualism in Capricorn, where there's the earthly crystallization. This is the Saturn element, the Satan, the limited crystallization of desire in its most densified, crusty form. So that can be the actualization of personal ambition. And that's not always a bad thing, of course. It's just a matter of how are we responding to what energies and whether the chart's exoteric or esoteric. So esoterically, it is the recognition of divine purpose, the connection to that Father principle in the highest sense. And it will also, just in the same way as in an exoteric chart, will depict the kind of space one will enter in terms of that actualization of purpose, as well as their externalized field of, well, vocation and service. So it will be the same kinds of indicators there. However, it's just a matter of what is the deeper consciousness behind that. Planets in the 10th house will indicate any particular focal point towards that career, vocation, and purpose space. Sun in the 10th house can indicate someone who will be very much known for their career or their externalized field of service, a strong recognition in the public space. That doesn't necessarily have to be celebrity level status, but it could just be very much known in the community that one is connected to, or that field of expertise following from, let's say, education in the 9th house. And with, again, sun or moon, it could be that the individual in question really is identified with that work, which, by the way, could also be a limitation if we're comparing an exoteric chart to an esoteric chart, where there may be a certain hook or grasping of the personality towards its personal ambitions or its personal ideas of success and how it wants to present to the world, particularly given the fact that the 10th house would, for the most part, be in a square to the 1st house. So we might say approximately, if a sun's in the 10th house, there may be a square aspect to the rising sign. And if we're approaching that esoterically, we would say that there is a tension between the personality self and the purpose of the soul, right? So once again, it's just depending on the superimposition of these different angles of the charts, right? Malefics here can indicate challenges, struggles, obviously, limitations when it comes to the expression or the taking of one's divine destiny, so to speak. Saturn will bring delays, or there'll be very much a need to focus and discipline oneself, a constant sense of that Saturnian climb, mountain goat up the hill to really get there. Of course, the 10th house has that quality to it anyway, because it has this approximate correspondence to Capricorn. And we see that even in the most basic sense, where before we get to one's career, we have to go through all these other processes, literally and technically, where it's education and doing this and doing that, and the workspace in the 6th house, and all of this good stuff. A planet like Pluto here could indicate, from first impressions exoterically, some abusive authority figures being a potential delineation of the 10th house, given that would be a very crystallized and externalized surface expression of this idea of divine purpose. It's the ruling order, or the principle of law, where in the most highest and subjective being about the consciousness, in the subjective sense being the law by which I live by, which would be my spiritual purpose. So the most concrete, externalized, densified version of that would be external authority figures. So Pluto in the 10th may indicate an abusive father, even a mother, or some sort of difficult dynamic, even with the public space even. It could also be someone who brings a Plutonic quality out into the world, or they engage, their field of service is that of psychology or breaking down, expressing taboos, or all of these things that can be associated with Pluto. In the best case scenario, from still an exoteric point of view, it would be that psychological bent, or someone who brings transformative or investigative or penetrative processes into the kind of, that's the work that they do. That's where their focal point of purpose is. In the esoteric sense, Pluto in the 10th, and Pluto wherever it is in the chart, it's going to indicate where there will be a death and rebirth process. So that could be crises of disillusionment. That could be someone attaining their personality ambition in the 10th house and then discovering that it wasn't all that it cracked up to be, and that would be the Capricornian collapse, the Tower of Babel. That is the getting to the mountaintop and realizing that the foundations were made of sand. So Pluto may indicate in the 10th house these kinds of crisis periods of disillusionment, or a need to break down the personality structures and therefore be able to re-emerge and resurrect new forms of life energy and bring something new to the table. Really interesting example of someone with Pluto on the midheaven, it's very much an esoterically expressing chart, was Saint Teresa of Avila, who was most likely a 6th ray soul during the 1500s. She was a nun, and she had Pisces rising with Pluto, which would be her esoteric chart ruler, on the midheaven. And she went through a hell of a baptism in her lifetime. It is really a fascinating story. She was sick for most of her life. She had experiences of spontaneous levitation. Apparently it would happen actually in the church with her other sisters. And she would be embarrassed by it. She'd go into these spontaneous raptures and elevate up into the sky, and the nuns would have to hold her down. And she said in her diaries that she was so embarrassed by this experience that she prayed that it wouldn't happen to her again. And God, or in this case most likely the monad, her own monad, gave her the grace of not publicly embarrassing her by levitating her in the church. Okay, but an amazing chart example. She also had a lot of issues with authority figures. She was a woman at the time. She was in the field of the church, so all of the church politics and distorted authority figures, and a lot of male priests and leaders that were basically jealous and envious of her very obvious divine connection, although she had a couple of really important church authority figures who really believed in her and they saw who she was. But that's just a really fascinating chart where we see some of the power issues with just in the exoteric or personality level expression. But certainly from the esoteric point of view, with Pluto being the ascendant ruler esoterically, a lot of death and rebirth and deep astral purification and being able to resurrect and come back again. And she lived a very deeply dharmic life. So a very interesting example there. When looking at your own natal chart, we of course start with the zodiacal sign that the 10th house is cusping, and that those are going to bring in the quality of the zodiacal sign and those ray energies generally to that externalized field of service. And we look to the exoteric ruler of that sign in the chart with the esoteric ruler, see if there's any obvious angled relationships between those two rules. A positive one, there'll be a natural affinity between what the form aspect of life is doing, the personality, and what the soul's purpose wants to do. Of course, you need to still work out which one is which, but there'll be maybe a natural transference of those skills, or the personality will really easily get behind what the soul's trying to do. Where there's a negative or a challenging tension-based aspect, there'll be some direct conflict between the form aspect of life and the soul aspect of life. So that's a good place to start, and just generally outside of aspects between those two planets, looking at where those two different planets are and how they could be already expressing or might be potentially expressing in the life. This is going to indicate something about the purpose of the life, the culmination of the spiritual purpose, where that rising sign as the ultimate core expression of the soul is going to culminate in its kind of externalized field of service and its purpose work, how that is all going to amount to this mountaintop peak experience. So with that said, let's go to Ellen Oken's house list. Okay, we have 1, the Father, soul-centered expression, divine will revealed as the culmination of spiritual purpose. Okay, the mountaintop. 2, authority figures, the masters, hierarchy, and your particular teachers. There's another angle of that father archetype, or that octave up of the authority figures, as we spoke about as well. So potentially planets here could also indicate, particularly benefic planets, not just positive experiences in the field of expression of the 10th house and its externalized field of service, but also the kinds of authority figures that you engage with, or leaders or teachers and things like that. 3, honor and status, right? This is the claiming of your destiny and how you emerge in the collective space. Soul-centered expression, opportunity for spiritual advancement and responsibility. So coming back to that early point I mentioned when we started talking about the esoteric delineations, where it may not necessarily be a poignant or a specific indicator of what you're doing in a concrete sense, but certain kinds of spiritual processes of expansions of consciousness or revelations of divine purpose, and the grasping of one's spiritual responsibility, again, that collective edge there, or collective angle. 4, social responsibility, soul-centered, enforcing the plan of the masters. 5, career and profession, externalized field of service. Now, I have not been reading some of these little blips that Ellen has had after these column lists, but I just, this one stood out to me just as I was gazing over it with my eyes. A goal for the soul does not have to be in material form. Some people have very specific tasks to accomplish in the present incarnation, and these can be seen in both the soul-centered and personality-centered charts. So it's just an important point to realize someone in this lifetime may be really developing the consciousness, and there may be many kinds of internal processes of quietude and solitude and reflection, or very much more about the cultivation of that subjective space, in which case they may not be too much expressing in the obvious externalized space, and yet there still could be very much the achievement of a spiritual goal happening if the chart is responding esoterically, depending on where the individual is at in their own unfolding and all of that stuff. So if, for instance, you had the esoteric ruler of the 10th in the 4th house, we might say something about the spiritual purpose of this lifetime is about grounding into the incarnation. It's about working with the mother principle, and perhaps that could be concerned with literally some of those exoteric themes of family and bonds and all of this, or it could be connected to ancestry. Maybe if it's following on from the Pluto example, let's say you've got Pisces on the midheaven at the 10th house, you look to Pluto, it's in the 4th house. That could be an indication of the spiritual purpose of this lifetime is breaking through the limitations of the ancestry, in which case it may be very much a psychological kind of deep depth process that is going on of regenerating a lot of these past forms. So that's just an example again of the potentiality for the spiritual goal being these inner subjective experiences as well. Not to say that there wouldn't be some sort of externalized field of expression somewhere, but it might not be the main focus, and maybe you just are getting by with whatever is the line of least resistance for you in terms of your work in that sense, your practical daily, just paying the bill kinds of work. But there may be subjectively still very much an achievement of this spiritual process if you're really engaging with that. And yes, maybe that leads down the line to, following this 4th house example, someone becoming a depth psychologist or working with the mother principle or earth, nature, family, psychology, all of these potential themes that could lead to a field of expertise in that area. But once again, it's more about what is the subjective goal, and that being the first point of recognition or attention. But in summary, the 10th house is this place of the spiritual goal, whether that is a very clear, externalized goal in terms of really entering in the world, being a public figure. It can be the case for some people, but it could also be a subjective role or something a bit more subtle. That doesn't mean it's any less important, because of course, from the esoteric point of view, the subjective dimension of the inner experience is the spiritual reality, and that becomes the primary centering of one's consciousness, out of which can emerge the repatterning of the exoteric forms of life. So I hope you enjoyed this video on the 10th house considered from a soul-centered point of view, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye bye.